Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I really hope you're doing fabulously well and that you're having a really phenomenal day wherever you are in the world. Or if it's evening for you, I hope you're having a lovely evening. I know that our time zones are so different, but isn't it so wonderful that no matter where we are in the world, we can come together and enjoy a lovely story. And nothing in the world beats a fabulous story. I live by stories. I think there's nothing that enriches your life more. And it makes life so exciting. And I always identify with the fact that people in the olden days would sit by the fire listening to these incredible stories. And it's so nice to have a revival of them again. So let's get started with tonight's story. But before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And by the way, I want to send you, each and every one of you, loads of love. So let's get started. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Arabella and I grew up in Seattle in a very attractive neighbourhood with my parents and two boisterous sisters in the early 80s. My sisters were very rambunctious and rather wild growing up, and sometimes they behaved more like boys than like little girls. They would climb trees and tear around the neighbourhood on their bicycles. Of course, I played with my sisters all the time, but I was the only one that never climbed the trees and was much more careful riding my bike around the neighbourhood, lest I should fall or hurt myself. I was relentlessly teased about how feminine I was because I adored everything beautiful, from flowers to animals and exquisite beautiful views. And I loved all the finer things in life, like the creature comforts and modern luxuries. I also adored baking and cooking, and from an early age my family was spoiled by my aspiring culinary prowess, as I was always turning out exquisite cakes and delicious meals, even if I say so myself. My sister Amanda would always tease me relentlessly and say that the man that I one day married would become so fat, like a huge whale, because I would spoil and feed him up so much that he would be bouncing around the place like a large beach ball. Everyone heartily agreed, and thought the prospect of my marrying a man that ballooned so much that he finally morphed into a gargantuan blue whale was terribly funny. My father was an exceedingly brilliant, clever man who worked in the banking world and was remarkably successful and affluent, while my avant-garde mother was very controversial, artistic, feisty and exceedingly dramatic. She revelled in the world of art and loved nothing better than to shock people and cause a stir by saying the most outlandish, outrageous things that would always get strange reactions. I remember her being a terrible flirt when it came to other men. My father was never bothered about my mother's coquettish behaviour because he knew that it was completely harmless and would never lead to anything, because my mother was so committed to her marriage and loved the bones of my father. She just could not help her public displays of outrageous, provocative flirting. That was just something that was part of the way she was. There were times my parents would have the most dramatic fights that would put the dramas on television like Dallas to shame. Those film producers could have taken some lessons of drama from the antics of my mother and dad, and they would have learnt a thing or two, let me tell you. I remember one day my mother barged out of the house shouting, "I'm leaving you, Peter, for good!" And she stormed out of the house and drove her car to the nearest movie theatre. My father knew exactly where she'd going, and so he got a taxi to the movie theatre and took with him my mother's spare set of car keys and drove her car back home. He then proceeded to drive his car to the movie theatre, and he waited for her in the car park. And when my mother came out after the film had finished, he described her coming out of the theatre looking very perturbed and incredibly shocked because she could not find her car anywhere. My father drove up to her, pulled down the window and said, "Sally, dear, would you like a lift?" Finally, she got into the car with a very sulky look on her face. She really did not like to get caught out like this. Growing up, we always had bulldogs, and I mean English bulldogs, because my father adored the breed. They had lovely flat pug-like faces, and he would walk them every single day. The trouble is they never wanted to come back home, and you literally had to drag them. One thing about bulldogs, if you know anything about them, they're exceedingly stubborn. One day our oversized bulldog called Tweed parked herself literally in the middle of the road and simply refused to budge even an inch. I was with my father at the time, and I was coaxing and encouraging and pulling her with the lead, but it was to no avail. It was not long before Tweed had literally caused a huge traffic congestion in our road and a pile-up of traffic with about 40 cars, one behind the other, many becoming impatient. "What's holding up the traffic?" shouted one man a couple of cars down. "It's a bulldog," shouted another. She's simply refusing to budge from the middle of the road." Finally, someone with a wheelbarrow from a neighbouring home came to our rescue, and we managed to evacuate our bulldog by plunging her into the wheelbarrow and wheeling her home. She looked very pleased with herself to be getting a lift and not to have to walk. Tweed seemed to enjoy the strange transportation home, and she had a look of absolute jubilation on her face. Everyone in the car started to clap, applaud, and literally whistle. There was even an article in the paper written about Tweed, and it read the following: "Tweed, a white, very hefty bulldog with a very stubborn disposition, did not want to return home after her morning walk with owner Mr. Peter Harrington. It would seem that the large white bulldog had other ideas and decided that a nap in the middle of a busy Seattle road early in the morning was clearly a great idea. Despite the best efforts to coax Tweed away and to move her across the road, it was to no avail. She simply would not budge. As a result, this English bulldog caused major hold-ups and traffic congestion, much to the delight of all the drivers. Tweed was then evacuated to her home by being forcefully removed in a wheelbarrow." Driver Rick Martin described the scene as, "It made my day. I have never laughed so much in my entire life. That Tweed was such a character. I think we should take a leaf out of Tweed's book and remember that life is not about rushing all the time." So Tweed really made an impact on so many people's lives. When I was very young, I would love nothing better than our family trips to Bloomingdale's, and the cosmetic department with its bright lights and beautiful counters was simply like eye candy for me. I was in utter awe of the exclusive cosmetic houses from Christian Dior to Lancôme and Yves Saint Laurent. I thought the elegant, swanky women behind those counters were stunningly beautiful and very snazzy. I wanted to be exactly like them when I grew up. When I was older, I qualified as a beauty therapist, and one day I found myself working behind a cosmetic counter in Bloomingdale's, and I never ever looked back. I was so passionate about serving my customers and examining their skin, giving them cosmetic and makeup advice, and I adored my job and was extremely successful. I worked for about 3 prestigious cosmetic companies, including Lancôme and Christian Dior, and it was a wonderful, memorable and very special time in my life. One day all the cosmetic girls got together for a Christmas dinner in an upmarket stylish restaurant in Seattle, and those who were married brought along their partners as well. That was when I first met him. He was strikingly handsome and very, very charming, and he couldn't keep his eyes off me. There was only one problem, and that was he was married to one of the cosmetic girls at Bloomingdale's. I knew that I was not the kind of girl who would ever date a married man, and so I never gave him a second, even fleeting thought. Several months later, I was in a bookstore looking at some books when I was approached by a handsome man that I'd met once at the Christmas party. His name was Andre, and he asked me if I remembered him. "Of course," I said. "I remember you from the cosmetic Christmas party." We started to engage in a conversation when he surreptitiously let slip that he was now officially divorced from his wife, and he wasted no time in asking me out for dinner. In truth, I was in 2 minds about whether to accept a date from a divorcee or not, and also someone who had been previously married to one of the cosmetic girls I worked with at Bloomingdale's. I wondered if dating an ex-husband was the wise thing to do, given the sensitivity of the circumstances, but in the end I could not resist the lure of his beguiling, bedazzling and seductive charms. I did, however, tell Andre's ex-wife that I had accepted a date from her husband, and hoped that she didn't mind. I just didn't want her to find out that I was surreptitiously dating him behind her back. "You are welcome to date him," she told me, "but I do need to warn you that he's very intense and exceedingly possessive, and he doesn't take kindly to rejection." I was not sure what she meant by what she said, but I wasn't concerned either, because I was very attracted to Andre at the time, and there was an undeniable spark and chemistry between us, and so I suppose I just dived right into the deep end, so to speak. It was not long before I started dating Andre regularly, and he showered me with expensive presents such as flowers and chocolates, and he quite literally swept me off my feet. Naturally, I loved all the attentive devotion, but after a while alarm bells started ringing in my head. I noticed that he was becoming exceedingly possessive over me, and that made me very, very uncomfortable. One day in a restaurant, as we were enjoying our seafood dinner together, Andre noticed a gentleman glancing at me with an approving look on his face, and he stormed over to the table and literally threatened the man. "You keep your eyes off my girl," he snapped. I knew immediately that I had big problems, and over time Andre became more and more possessive and very aggressive towards any man that showed me the slightest bit of interest that could be a potential threat to his relationship with me. One day in a restaurant in Seattle, I literally told Andre that our relationship was finished, that we needed to end it, and I told him it was because it wasn't working. Andre did not say a word. For a long while he sat there in silence, but his face went blood red and he was expressionless. But I could sense he was fuming. He paid the bill and we retreated back to the car, and then he drove to a quiet area. I remember thinking that he just wanted to talk, but to my amazement he pulled out his gun and asked me to climb into his boot. "Andre," I said, "don't be so silly. Let's talk about this." I could tell Andre was serious because his brown eyes looked enraged. "Get into the boot," he screamed. "Get into the boot now, or I'll shoot you." I promptly obeyed because he was holding his gun to my head, and I sensed he meant business. I'm not sure how long I was in the back of that boot, or where Andre was taking me. I did try to get out of the boot, but there was no way out. It was locked. My heart was pounding, and my thoughts were racing, as I literally tried to figure out how was the best way to get out of this precarious situation that I found myself in. Perhaps I should pretend that I didn't want to break up with him after all, but I wasn't sure if I could successfully pull the wool over his eyes. I knew Andre was not a stupid person and would not be easily fooled. I do not know how long I lay cooped up in the back of that boot, but it did seem like an age. And yet it was so dark and claustrophobic, being in such a confined, horrible space. I could feel the wheel of the cars riding over this bumpy terrain and gravel, and I could feel that they were dirt roads, so I knew we were in the countryside somewhere. Finally Andre opened the boot. "You can get out now," he said, holding the gun to my head. "We're in the middle of nowhere," he said. "There is not a solitary soul or house for miles, and so you can scream all you like, because no one will hear you." "Why are you doing this, Andre?" I asked. "Why can we not talk about things like civilized adults?" "There is nothing to talk about," snapped Andre. "You made your position very clear. You have decided you want to end things with us, and you barely know me. You've not even given me a chance to persuade you that I am the one for you." "Are there no other ways to persuade me than stuff me in a boot and threaten me with a gun? Surely we can work things out," I said. "Stop talking," snapped Andre, "and follow me to the trailer over there." He was pointing his gun at me, but I knew trying to run would be absolutely futile. He would definitely catch me, and besides, where would I run to? And I was in the middle of nowhere. There was really no point. The trailer was indeed very large and was lavishly decorated with a very comfortable furnishings and looked like a cosy, sumptuous den. And the kitchen cabinets were incredibly well stocked, with tins, juices, long-life milk and freeze-dried food, and there was also a gas energy supply. It was almost as if Andre had prepared himself for every eventuality, and indeed living off-grid, and being out of town for a while. "I have given so much up for you," he said, as he ordered me to sit down at the kitchen table and proceeded to pour me a juice. "I ended my marriage for you," he continued. "When I saw you at that Christmas party, I knew I had to have you. And now this is how you repay me," he said, kicking the chair violently. "If I cannot have you, no one can," he said. "Do you know what I mean by that?" "No," I stammered. "What do you mean?" "It'll be lights out," he said, "for me and for you," he said, cocking his rifle to his head. "If I cannot have you in life, I will indeed have you in death, and it's as simple and straightforward as that. I'm not giving up on us. I believe in us. You're all I've ever wanted and desired, and now you're treating me like the turd on your shoe. Is that fair? Now I ask you again, is that fair?" he shouted. "No, it's not," I said. "No, it's not." All the while we talked, I realised that Andre was completely mad, and that he was willing to shoot us both dead if I didn't agree to this relationship. I started stringing him along to try and reassure him that he was indeed the one for me, and that I was falling in love with him, but I could tell he was not convinced by my act. "How do I know that you're telling me the truth?" he said. "You could be saying anything to lull me into a false sense of security." For a long time we just chatted and chatted, but it seemed that I failed to persuade him that I wanted to continue with our relationship. I think he sensed I wasn't telling him what he wanted to hear, and he was not buying any of it. I spent several days in the trailer going over our relationship again and again with a fine-tooth comb, trying to persuade and convince him that I was crazy about him. But luckily our relationship was not physical at this stage, and so he wasn't crossing those boundaries, because despite everything, amazingly enough, he actually did respect me. One day Andre, who'd been drinking copious amounts of coffee to stay awake over the last few days in order to make sure I did not make a hasty escape. However, soon it would seem that emotional and physical exhaustion literally got the better of him, and suddenly he fell fast asleep with his head on the kitchen table. I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to escape. The trouble was I was literally in the middle of nowhere, without any clue as to where I was geographically. I had thought of escaping many, many times, but I knew it would be infinitely more preferable to talk Andre around, but that was clearly not working. The thought of escaping was so overwhelmingly daunting for me because I had absolutely no idea where on earth to go. And the idea of running through a vast wooded area that stretched back for literally miles scared the living daylights out of me. I'm not going to kid. There were all kinds of considerations to take into account, like Andre chasing after me and shooting at me at point-blank range, which was not impossible given his mental state. Then, of course, there was the fact that it was very daunting to be running around in an area where I had no clue where I was. And then getting lost in the woods, or being devoured by a dangerous wild animal. I would not describe myself as a courageous person by any manner of means, but I knew I had to get out of this situation and fast before things turned very ugly and violent. I could not escape in his car because his car keys were worn over his neck like a necklace, and his gun was tucked in his gun holty, and I knew it would be absolutely impossible to take them off him without disturbing him and waking him up. That just could not happen. Luckily, Andre had not locked the trailer door because I guess he knew I had nowhere to run anyway and was pretty confident that I was too cowardly to escape from such a remote area, and normally he would be right, but not on this occasion. He had assured me that if I tried to run away, I literally could be ravaged by a mountain lion or a team of coyotes, and was convinced. I was actually convinced that he was right about that. Before I knew it, I was out of the trailer in the afternoon sun and running for my life as fast as I possibly could towards the woods. And once I entered the woods, I just kept moving forwards and forwards without really knowing where on earth I was going. I really felt like a rabbit in a maze, as there were tall, majestic trees everywhere, and in this woody wilderness I felt incredibly vulnerable and afraid. I just thought if I ran in a straight line, that eventually the woods would end on the side of a road, and hopefully I'd be able to flag down someone in a passing car. I just wanted to believe with all my heart that that would be the case, and so I kept visualising that road in my mind and believing with every part of my being that I would invariably find it. Fortunately, I was wearing long black pants and shoes, which offered me a little protection from the thorny briars and poison ivy that I encountered. Luckily, the wooded area was not too overgrown, and I could run through it relatively easily. As I ran, I had a few hair-raising moments, especially when I surprised a mother deer and her fawn, who scuttled off quickly, looking at me with surprise, as if I was the last thing they ever expected to encounter. I noticed squirrels darting up trees and nibbling acorns, eyeing me with a reverent curiosity. I also observed rabbits darting in their burrows, and it seemed that the forest was just teeming with wildlife, and I certainly got the impression that none of these animals had encountered humans many times before. I noticed the woods were exquisitely beautiful, and the birdsong was breathtakingly enchanting, and the shafts of sunlight danced through the woods and illuminated the ferns and shrubbery on the forest floor with a soft, white, pretty light. When you're afraid, it is amazing how much better you can run, because I have never run as fast as I did on this occasion. I was sweaty, filthy, dirty, clammy, and bleeding in places on my face and hands from the dagger-like sharp thorns that had pierced my skin, but truly I didn't care. All that mattered was escaping and getting away from Andre. Yet despite all of these negative influences, I continued to have an insatiable desire to overcome the obstacle of this large, seemingly impenetrable forest. I was certain that Andre would be hot on my trail by now, and I knew that speed was of the utmost essence. Suddenly I heard the ominous rumble of thunder, and I realized that I was about to be caught up in a heavy rainstorm, and suddenly the skies just opened, and the rain pelted down, and there was yellowed lightning flashing across the sky. I was becoming soaked and drenched to the skin, and was totally soaked, and I began to shiver and shake because I was feeling very cold. It seemed that there was nowhere that I could take cover. Even the large trees were not preventing the rain from saturating my clothes with water. I was so terrified of the inevitable threat of actually being struck by lightning. It was bad enough trying to escape from Andre, but I could have picked a better day for my escape than this. It was just my rotten luck to get caught up in this horrendous storm. It could only happen to me, I thought. I know it sounds absolutely pathetic and childish, but I just fell onto my knees in the rain, and I began to sob and sob and sob. I was so drenched to the skin in rain. I was emotionally exhausted and physically drained, and literally soaked to the skin like a drowned rat. The next thing I knew was that I was being lifted up into the air and thrown over this large pair of shoulders, and I was too shocked and amazed to scream, because what was happening was so surreal. It was almost like I had to pinch myself to actually believe that this was happening. At first I thought I'd been grabbed by a bear, but I could see that the creature had human-like hands and feet that made me relax a little bit more. The hairy critter ran with me so very fast, and before I knew it, I found myself in a very large cave in a rocky outcrop in a wooded clearing, and I was being placed on the ground by a very strange-looking creature, the likes of such that I have never ever seen before. I was so relieved to be out of the rain, but I realised that this curious critter was not a loner, but there were 3 others exactly like herself in this large cave, taking cover. I'm a very shy person by nature, but when the large creature indicated for me to take off my clothes, I did so unhesitantly. I did not feel self-conscious in front of these critters, as I would have indeed in front of humans. The female creature who had rescued me proceeded to hand me a huge animal pelt, which I wrapped around my body very gratefully. I could sense she was trying to help me, and I watched her hanging up my drenched clothes in the cave to dry. I could see that the cave was covered in animal pelts that literally carpeted the entire floor like a thick carpet, so it was very comfortable sitting on the ground, even though it did smell a little funky. The creatures were all very tall, but the tallest must have been about 10 foot, and the shortest I would say was about 3 foot and under 100 pounds. They were covered from head to toe with long brownish red hair. They looked so human-like it was almost uncanny, and it was this humanness that I could see in them that made me feel that I was relatable to these creatures. Like, for example, zebras and horses in a field together. Although they're both different, they can sense their commonality. At least I think they can. I will admit that next to these creatures, I did feel like a fragile, delicate and tiny doll by contrast, because they were burly, thick and powerfully strong. As I was sitting on the floor waiting for the rain to stop, the creatures were incredibly kind to me and showed me no sign of aggression whatsoever, nor did I believe for a single moment that they were keeping me against my will. The little creature was so incredibly affectionate and came up to me and stood over my hair, playing with it and twisting it in his thick hands, and it was like he was looking for nits. It really was quite amusing. It also felt like he was giving me the most amazing head massage because his fingers were so very firm and big and strong. And although young and small, he was powerful. The little critter was the friendliest of all the creatures, who were all a little shy and reticent, especially the large male, who looked at me a little warily and apprehensively, and possibly was not too convinced it was a great idea my sharing the cave with him and his family. After a while he physically relaxed as he watched me engaging and playing happily with his little son in the cave. One of the games we played is this little critter would get me to shut my eyes, and then he would pass me an acorn, and I was expected to feel it, examine it, and then put it back in the pile of acorns. When I opened my eyes and pointed to the acorn he had given me, invariably I always got it wrong. You see, I had to guess which the correct acorn was. Every time I got it wrong, the little critter was utterly delighted and enthralled, and before long all the critters were playing the game with me. I think they found it hard to believe that anyone could be so terrible and pathetic at a game, and not only did they find that amusing, they also enjoyed winning. They were brilliant at the game because they could tell and feel the difference with every acorn that they picked up with their fingers, and they knew which one was which. The rain came down heavily all night, and I was so utterly exhausted I fell into a deep sleep on the skin floor. And when I woke up in the morning, I was amazed how light and bright it actually was. I immediately put my clothes on that I'm glad to say had dried overnight. The creatures were all sitting, watching and observing me, wondering what I was going to do next. But the little one dashed towards me, rubbing his affectionate head against my shoulders, and I ruffled the hair on his head. I pointed to the outside of the cave, indicating to the creatures that I wanted to go now, and they seemed to understand what I was saying. Then I suddenly had a magnificent idea. I immediately pulled away the deerskin rug to draw with a stick on the dirt floor what I wanted to impress upon the creatures, so they gathered around me to watch what I was doing. I proceeded to draw the forest trees, then I drew a road and cars, and I pointed to myself and the road, trying to get through to them that was where I wanted to go. I couldn't believe it that the creatures actually understood what I was trying to say, and the male proceeded to draw what I had drawn, and then I nodded, and he understood completely what I was saying to him. So he escorted me out of the cave, and then I began to walk next to him. I was so slow that he finally shook his head in disapproval and squatted on his legs and pointed to his shoulders, and I got on to the top of him, and he literally ran through that forest with me on his back at such a fast pace. He was as fast as a cheetah. It was hard to fathom that anything could run like this, and I truly enjoyed riding him far better than any horse that I've ridden in the past, because he was so agile and strong, and I felt incredibly safe. Suddenly the forest ended, and there I was on the side of a very dirt road, and I thought the creature would go, but believe it or not, he was so courteous that he actually waited for me. It was an hour or so before someone came driving down the dirt road, and I finally waved the car down, and finally got help. The creature watched me behind the tree, taking care not to be observed by the human driver, and then he galloped to the woods. Fast forward a few weeks, and I returned home to find that Andre had returned to Seattle and actually shot himself in the head at point-blank range. He had phoned his ex-wife and told her that I had left him and he couldn't live without me. It was all desperately sad, but I didn't go to the police to file abduction charges because what was the point? He was already dead. I also did not want to sour the precious memory his family may have had of him, because that would be a dreadful thing to do, given their inevitable grief that they were facing. For a while I did blame myself for what actually happened to Andre, but I realized that it couldn't be my fault. I now know years later that that creature that I encountered in the wood, and all those 3 creatures, were in fact Bigfoots, and I believe the female witnessed my sorry state and rescued me from the rain. I think she felt compassionate towards me. I fell in love with the little one, and I would have gladly taken him home with me in a heartbeat, but that would never have been possible, nor would it have ever been wise. Even when I share a cave with Bigfoots, I learnt that they are indeed private, very elusive creatures, and they hate to have their space invaded. It took a while for the big creature to finally warm up to me. I will say this, and that is that they are remarkably intelligent, discerning and perceptive creatures, and I believe they will help people in dire situations, as they most certainly helped me. All I want to say is that is the most phenomenal story. Thank you so very much for sharing it with us. I cannot imagine what you went through. What an extraordinary story, and what a wonderful ending. Until next time, goodbye and good night.